Stop scrolling for a moment, because what you are about to hear is not a headline you saw on television, not a soundbite debated on social media, and not a story most investors even realize has already unfolded. Yet it may prove to be one of the most consequential trade decisions affecting global commodity markets in years. While attention was focused on tariffs hitting automobiles, electronics, steel, and consumer goods, a quiet exemption buried inside a series of executive orders fundamentally altered the treatment of one of the most strategic materials in the modern economy. That material is silver. This is not a story about speculation or price predictions. It is a story about policy architecture, supply chains, and how a single regulatory decision can reshape global market incentives without triggering immediate headlines. To understand why silver now occupies a unique position in the global trade system, we have to begin with the broader context in which these decisions were made. From the opening days of the administration, trade policy moved from gradual adjustment to aggressive restructuring. Executive orders were signed at an accelerated pace, instructing federal agencies to reassess long-standing trade relationships, calculate cumulative trade deficits, and identify sectors deemed critical to national security. Using powers granted under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the administration formally declared that persistent trade imbalances and foreign trade practices constituted an unusual and extraordinary threat to the economic security of the United States. That declaration was not symbolic. It unlocked the legal authority to impose sweeping tariffs without congressional approval. What followed was not a targeted intervention, but a systemic shock. A baseline tariff of 10% was applied to imports from most trading partners. Additional penalties were layered onto specific countries depending on negotiations, geopolitical posture, and perceived compliance with U.S. demands. China faced the most severe escalation, with tariffs reaching extreme levels before partial temporary reductions. The European Union encountered fluctuating rates tied to ongoing negotiations. Canada and Mexico were subjected to duties linked not only to trade but also to border enforcement and narcotics policy. Industries across the economy were pulled into the tariff framework. Steel and aluminum remained under national security tariffs. Automobiles and auto parts faced scrutiny. Copper, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and lumber were placed under investigation. The message was clear. Global trade would no longer operate under the assumptions that defined the previous 3 decades. To most observers, it appeared nothing was spared. That perception was incorrect. Hidden inside the executive orders and their subsequent technical modifications was a carefully constructed exemption framework. Certain goods were removed from reciprocal tariff exposure and reassigned to protected classifications. Among those goods was bullion. In trade terminology, bullion includes gold, silver, platinum, and palladium in the form of bars, ingots, and coins. Gold's exemption was explicit and widely acknowledged. Silver's protection followed from its inclusion in the same classification, confirmed through regulatory interpretation and industry guidance. This was not a coincidence, it was not an oversight, and it was not driven by concern for investors. The United States does not produce enough silver to meet domestic demand. That reality alone dictated policy. Silver is not merely a precious metal stored in vaults or minted into coins. It is a critical industrial input embedded deeply into the modern economy. Solar panels rely on silver paste for conductivity. Electronics depend on silver for circuit connections. Medical devices use silver for its antimicrobial properties. Electric vehicles, advanced batteries, water purification systems, telecommunications infrastructure, and defense technologies all require silver in quantities that dwarf investment demand. Imposing tariffs on silver imports would have created immediate and severe consequences. Manufacturers would face instant cost inflation on a critical input. Supply chains, already strained by global trade tensions, would fracture further. Consumer prices would rise across multiple sectors. Strategic industries tied to national security would face procurement challenges. The very goals of the tariff regime, reshoring production and strengthening domestic manufacturing, would be undermined. So silver was exempted. But the consequences of that exemption go far beyond preventing damage. They create a structural asymmetry in global trade. Silver now enters the United States without tariff friction, while many finished goods that contain silver do not. This distinction may appear technical, but its implications are profound. Raw materials flow freely, while value-added production abroad is penalized. The incentive structure shifts decisively toward domestic manufacturing. If a company imports silver directly, it faces no tariff. If it imports electronics, solar panels, or medical devices manufactured abroad using silver, it may face duties ranging from 10% to well over 100% depending on origin. The economic signal is unmistakable. Import silver. Build domestically. Avoid tariffs. This is not accidental policy design, it is deliberate. For industries that rely heavily on silver, this framework alters long-term investment decisions. Factory locations, supply chain contracts, capital expenditures, and workforce planning all respond to tariff incentives. Over time, this structure increases domestic silver demand while complicating global distribution. And this is where the story begins to extend beyond U.S. borders. Global silver production has remained relatively flat for years. Major producers are concentrated in a handful of countries with limited capacity for rapid expansion. New mines require years of exploration, permitting, and capital investment. Supply is not elastic. At the same time, global demand continues to rise. Industrial applications are expanding. Renewable energy deployment accelerates. Electrification increases silver intensity across manufacturing. Medical and technological usage grows steadily. Against this backdrop, a tariff-free entry point into the world's largest consumer economy becomes a powerful gravitational force. Silver flows toward where it can be used most efficiently. The exemption also carries an implicit recognition of silver's monetary character. Unlike most industrial commodities, silver functions simultaneously as an input and a store of value. By placing bullion outside the tariff war, the administration effectively acknowledged that silver occupies a category distinct from ordinary trade goods. This recognition has implications for investors, manufacturers, and policymakers alike. It stabilizes access during periods of trade disruption. It preserves silver's role as an inflation hedge at a time when tariffs push prices higher across the economy. It ensures that silver remains globally fungible, free from policy-induced distortions that could fracture markets. Most people missed this entirely. They saw headlines about tariffs on cars and electronics. They heard debates about trade wars and retaliation, but they did not notice the quiet carve-out that protected one of the most strategically important materials in the modern economy. And that is why this matters, because markets do not reprice structural changes overnight. They absorb them slowly, often only after supply chains and capital flows have already adjusted. This executive order did not make silver more expensive immediately. It did something more subtle. It changed the rules governing where silver goes, how it is used, and why it matters. In the next part, we will examine how this exemption reshapes global supply chains, alters manufacturing incentives, and places silver at the center of a new trade architecture that most policymakers never openly discussed. The order has already been signed. The framework is already active. The consequences are just beginning to unfold. How a silver exemption rewires global supply chains. The moment silver was carved out of the tariff regime, something subtle but powerful began to happen beneath the surface of global trade. No announcements were made, no emergency meetings were televised, but inside corporate boardrooms, procurement departments, and supply chain models, assumptions quietly changed. To understand why, you have to understand how modern manufacturing actually works. In the globalized system that developed over the last 30 years, companies optimized production around cost minimization. Raw materials were sourced where they were cheapest. Components were assembled where labor was least expensive. Finished goods were shipped across borders under the assumption that trade friction would remain minimal and predictable. Tariffs break that assumption. When tariffs are imposed on finished goods but not on raw materials, the entire logic of offshoring begins to unravel. Suddenly, the advantage of manufacturing abroad shrinks, not because labor is more expensive, but because policy has inserted a new cost into the system. Silver's exemption is a textbook example of this dynamic. Silver is not a marginal input. It is embedded deep within the value chain of some of the most strategically important industries in the modern economy. Electronics, renewable energy, advanced medical technology, defense systems, and electric vehicles all rely on silver for conductivity, reliability, and durability. When silver itself remains tariff-free, but products built with silver do not, the incentive structure flips. A manufacturer importing silver into the United States pays no additional duty. A manufacturer importing solar panels, circuit boards, or medical devices built overseas may face tariffs substantial enough to erase any labor cost advantage. Over time, that difference compounds. This is how supply chains rewire, not through mandates, but through incentives. For multinational corporations, the question is no longer simply where labor is cheapest. It becomes where production is tariff efficient. And in a world of escalating trade barriers, tariff efficiency increasingly matters more than marginal wage differentials. Silver's protected status accelerates this shift. Consider the solar industry. Solar panels are among the most silver-intensive consumer technologies in existence. Silver paste is essential for photovoltaic cells. It is also one of the most expensive components of a solar panel. Demand for solar energy has been rising rapidly as governments push for decarbonization and energy independence. At the same time, many solar panels sold in the United States are manufactured abroad, particularly in Asia. When tariffs are imposed on imported solar panels but silver remains tariff-free, manufacturers face a clear choice. Continue producing abroad and absorb tariffs on finished goods, or import silver and manufacture domestically. The policy does not require a single explicit instruction. The math speaks for itself. Over time, capital flows respond. Factories follow incentives, and silver demand inside the United States increases as production shifts closer to end markets. The same logic applies to electronics. Modern electronics rely on silver for switches, contacts, circuit boards, and connectors. And while the amount of silver per device may be small, aggregate demand is enormous. Smartphones, laptops, vehicles, industrial control systems, and infrastructure hardware all depend on silver's unique properties. When tariffs raise the cost of importing finished electronics, manufacturers reassess production strategies. Importing raw silver tariff-free and assembling domestically becomes comparatively more attractive. The exemption quietly strengthens domestic demand for silver without a single subsidy or public announcement. Medical technology follows a similar pattern. Silver's antimicrobial properties make it indispensable in wound care, surgical tools, implants, and hospital equipment. Healthcare costs are politically sensitive. Policymakers are acutely aware that tariffs on medical supplies can quickly translate into higher costs for consumers and public health systems. By exempting silver, the administration reduced pressure on raw material costs while still maintaining leverage over finished goods manufacturing. The result is a gradual shift in production incentives toward domestic facilities that rely on tariff-free silver inputs. This is how policy reshapes industrial geography. But the implications extend beyond manufacturing location. They reach into global silver supply itself. Global silver production is geographically concentrated. Mexico and Peru account for a large share of mined silver. China remains both a significant producer and a dominant refiner. Australia and Russia contribute meaningful output. The United States produces silver, but not enough to satisfy domestic consumption. Silver supply is relatively inelastic. New production cannot be ramped up quickly in response to demand. Mines require years to develop. Environmental permitting, capital investment, and geopolitical risk all constrain supply growth. When demand rises in a large consumer market like the United States, global flows adjust accordingly. Silver moves toward where it can be used most efficiently. Tariff-free access becomes a magnet. This creates competitive pressure across global markets. Refiners, traders, and producers allocate supply based not only on price, but on policy friction. If silver can enter the United States without tariffs and be transformed into high-value products domestically, it becomes economically rational to direct supply there. This does not mean other markets are starved overnight. It means marginal flows shift. Over time, marginal flows matter. They determine where inventories build, where shortages emerge, and where pricing power develops. The exemption also intersects with geopolitics in ways that are not immediately obvious. China occupies a unique position in the silver ecosystem. It is both a producer of silver and the world's dominant manufacturer of silver-containing goods. Under the tariff framework, China can still export raw silver to the United States without penalty. However, Chinese-made finished goods face significant barriers. This structure separates raw material trade from value-added manufacturing. From a policy perspective, it allows the United States to maintain access to critical inputs while discouraging dependence on foreign manufacturing capacity. From China's perspective, it limits export competitiveness in higher margin products while preserving commodity revenue. This asymmetry is intentional. It reflects a broader strategy of decoupling value chains without severing raw material access. Silver sits squarely within that strategy. There's also a financial dimension. Trade wars introduce volatility into currency markets. When tariffs escalate, capital moves. Exchange rates adjust. Confidence shifts. In such environments, precious metals regain importance as neutral assets that exist outside sovereign credit systems. Silver's exemption ensures that it remains fully tradable and accessible during periods of trade disruption. It preserves its role as both an industrial input and a monetary hedge at a time when policy uncertainty is elevated. That dual role is rare. Most commodities are either inputs or stores of value. Silver is both. The administration's decision implicitly acknowledged this distinction. By exempting bullion, policymakers signaled that silver should not be treated as a conventional trade weapon. It is too embedded, too critical, and too interconnected with national security to be subjected to the same pressure tactics as consumer goods. This recognition places silver in a category alongside other strategic materials, subject to separate national security reviews. Silver appears repeatedly in defense systems, communications infrastructure, and energy technology. Its availability affects military readiness, grid stability, and healthcare resilience. Tariffing such a material would introduce unnecessary risk. Instead, policy was structured to ensure continuity of access. The result is a market environment where silver becomes structurally advantaged relative to other industrial commodities. While copper, steel, aluminum, and semiconductors face tariff exposure and policy risk, silver flows with fewer restrictions. That difference matters. It changes how corporations hedge risk. It changes how investors assess exposure. It changes how governments plan procurement. Most importantly, it changes how silver is valued, not merely as a speculative asset, but as a strategic resource insulated from some of the most disruptive forces in global trade. In the next part, we will examine how this policy choice intersects with inflation, currency dynamics, investment behavior, and long-term price formation. We will look at why silver's role as both an industrial metal and a monetary asset becomes increasingly important in a tariff-driven world, and why the market may be underestimating the significance of this shift. The exemption is already in place. The incentives are already active. The question is not whether silver's position has changed. It is whether markets have fully recognized how far-reaching that change may be. Inflation, currency pressure, and the return of silver as money. The most immediate effect of tariffs is not diplomatic tension or political theater. It is inflation. Tariffs are, by definition, taxes on imports. Whether imposed for strategic, political, or economic reasons, their mechanical effect is straightforward. They raise costs. Those costs do not disappear. They are absorbed temporarily by corporations, passed on to consumers, or distributed across supply chains through lower margins, higher prices, or reduced investment. Over time, inflationary pressure becomes embedded in the system. This is where silver's exemption takes on a second, deeper meaning. In a tariff-driven environment, most commodities face upward price pressure due to policy friction. Silver does not. It enters the economy without tariff-induced distortion, even as the goods and services around it become more expensive. That asymmetry gives silver a unique advantage as a hedge against policy-driven inflation. Historically, silver has always occupied a dual role. It is both a commodity and a monetary asset. Unlike purely industrial metals, silver responds not only to supply and demand in manufacturing, but also to shifts in confidence, currency stability, and monetary policy. Tariffs affect all three. When trade wars escalate, inflation expectations rise, central banks face difficult choices: raise interest rates to combat inflation and risk slowing growth, or tolerate higher prices to preserve employment and financial stability. Either path introduces uncertainty. In such environments, investors seek assets that sit outside the direct control of central banks and fiscal authorities. Gold traditionally receives the most attention, but silver often follows, sometimes with greater volatility and leverage due to its smaller market size. What makes the current environment different is that silver is not merely reacting to macroeconomic stress. It is also benefiting from favorable policy treatment at the same time. This combination is rare. Inflation driven by tariffs erodes purchasing power. Silver historically preserves purchasing power over long periods. Tariffs raise the cost of imported goods. Silver remains exempt from those costs. Manufacturing reshoring increases industrial demand for silver. Investment uncertainty increases monetary demand for silver. Each of these forces reinforces the others. Currency dynamics amplify the effect. Trade wars destabilize exchange rates. Countries subject to tariffs see export demand weaken, which can pressure their currencies. Retaliatory measures introduce further volatility. Capital flows become less predictable. Hedging costs rise. In this environment, assets that do not depend on a single sovereign currency gain appeal. Silver is priced globally, but its value does not rely on the creditworthiness of any one government. It does not require a central bank guarantee. It does not depend on payment systems that can be sanctioned or disrupted. It is universally recognized and liquid. The exemption from tariffs preserves this neutrality. It ensures that silver remains freely tradable even as other goods become entangled in geopolitical disputes. That matters for international investors, central banks, and institutions managing cross-border exposure. There's also a psychological component. When governments impose tariffs broadly, they signal a willingness to intervene aggressively in markets. That perception alone can change behavior. Investors begin to question what else might be restricted, taxed, or regulated in the future. Silver's protected status sends a countersignal. It suggests that even in a highly interventionist policy environment, some assets remain outside the line of fire. That perception reinforces silver's role as a safe harbor. This does not mean silver prices move in a straight line. Silver is volatile. It responds to economic cycles, industrial demand, investor sentiment, and speculative flows. But volatility does not negate structural shifts. Structural shifts determine the long-term trend. From an investment perspective, the exemption changes silver's risk-reward profile. Previously, silver faced the same policy risk as other commodities. It could be taxed, restricted, or targeted in trade disputes. That risk limited its appeal as a long-term hedge in a world increasingly shaped by government intervention. Now, that risk is reduced. Silver sits outside the tariff regime that is reshaping global trade. It benefits indirectly from inflation without being directly penalized by policy. It gains from manufacturing reshoring without facing import barriers. It attracts monetary demand without being targeted as a speculative excess. This combination is unusual. It also explains why institutional interest in silver has quietly increased, even if retail attention remains limited. Large investors rarely move markets abruptly. They accumulate gradually. They respond to policy frameworks rather than headlines. They position for structural change, not short-term price moves. The tariff exemption provides such a framework. It clarifies how silver will be treated in a world of persistent trade friction. It reduces uncertainty. It allows long-term modeling of supply, demand, and pricing without the risk of sudden policy reversal. That predictability matters. Contrast this with other commodities. Copper faces potential tariffs and export controls. Rare earth elements are subject to geopolitical leverage. Energy markets are heavily politicized. Agricultural goods are frequently targeted in trade disputes. Silver, by comparison, occupies a relatively insulated position. There is also an important distinction between paper silver and physical silver. Financial instruments tied to silver, futures, options, exchange-traded funds, respond quickly to macroeconomic signals. Physical silver responds to logistics, fabrication capacity, and real-world demand. The exemption strengthens the physical market by ensuring that raw silver flows freely into manufacturing and investment channels. That physical demand underpins long-term price stability in ways that paper markets alone cannot. This is particularly relevant in periods of stress. In financial crises, paper assets can behave unpredictably. Liquidity evaporates, correlations rise, counterparty risk becomes visible. Physical assets, while less liquid, retain intrinsic value. Silver's role in this context is not speculative, it is defensive. The policy environment reinforces that role. By exempting silver, the administration implicitly acknowledged its importance not only to industry, but to financial stability. It recognized that disrupting silver supply would have cascading effects across multiple sectors, from energy to healthcare to defense. That recognition carries weight. It suggests that silver will continue to receive special treatment in future policy decisions, even as trade tensions evolve. It places silver closer to critical infrastructure than to discretionary consumption. For investors, this matters because it reduces tail risk. It lowers the probability that silver will be caught unexpectedly in regulatory crossfire. It also raises an important question. If silver is protected because it is essential, scarce, and foundational, why is it still treated by markets as a marginal asset? Part of the answer lies in habit. Gold dominates narratives. Equity markets dominate portfolios. Silver exists in an awkward space between industrial input and monetary hedge. But policy changes have a way of forcing reevaluation. When governments treat an asset differently, markets eventually follow. The silver exemption is not a price signal. It is a structural signal. It tells you how policymakers see the world, what they consider essential, and where they draw the line between leverage and self-harm. That perspective is invaluable. In the final part, we will bring these threads together. We will examine what this policy shift means for the global silver market over the long term, how it may influence price formation, and how investors, institutions, and governments are likely to respond as the implications become clearer. The order has been signed, the incentives are in motion. The question now is how long it takes for markets to fully internalize what this exemption really means. The long game. Why this decision matters more than it seems. When historians look back at this period, they are unlikely to point to a single dramatic moment when the global trade system changed. There will be no collapse date, no overnight repricing that marks the shift. Instead, they will identify a series of quiet decisions, technical adjustments, exemptions, classifications, that cumulatively altered incentives and redirected capital. The exemption of silver from the tariff regime will likely be one of those moments, not because it triggered immediate disruption, but because it revealed how policymakers understand the strategic landscape and how they intend to navigate it. At its core, this decision reflects a recognition that not all commodities are equal. Some materials are interchangeable, others are foundational. Silver belongs firmly in the latter category. Silver is woven into the fabric of modern economic life. It conducts electricity, enables renewable energy, supports medical technology, and underpins advanced manufacturing. At the same time, it exists outside the credit system as a tangible store of value. Few assets operate across so many domains simultaneously. That is why policy treatment matters. By exempting silver from tariffs while imposing duties across much of the global economy, the administration implicitly classified silver as too important to disrupt. That classification has consequences far beyond trade statistics. It shapes how companies invest. It influences how supply chains are structured. It alters how investors perceive risk. Over time, these effects accumulate. Consider capital allocation. Manufacturers do not respond instantly to tariffs. They model scenarios. They stress test assumptions. They examine policy durability. When an exemption persists, it becomes part of long-term planning. Silver's tariff-free status reduces uncertainty around input costs. That predictability encourages investment in silver-intensive industries within the United States. Over years, not quarters, This increases domestic demand for silver while tightening global supply. Tighter supply does not automatically mean higher prices in the short term. Markets can absorb imbalance for extended periods. Inventories shift, paper contracts adjust. But eventually, physical realities assert themselves. Silver is not infinitely substitutable. There are few alternatives with comparable conductivity, durability, and antimicrobial properties. Efficiency gains can reduce usage per unit, but aggregate demand continues to rise as applications expand. At the same time, mining supply faces constraints. Environmental regulations, geopolitical risk, declining ore grades, and capital discipline limit production growth. These are structural limits, not cyclical ones. Policy cannot change geology. The tariff exemption does not create silver, it simply ensures access. But by channeling demand toward domestic production and insulating silver from trade friction, it increases the likelihood that supply constraints become more visible over time. This has implications for price formation. Silver prices have historically been volatile and often disconnected from fundamentals due to speculative flows and its dual nature as both industrial metal and monetary asset. However, structural shifts tend to reassert fundamentals eventually. The exemption strengthens the link between physical demand and policy. It embeds silver deeper into national security, energy strategy, and industrial planning. That embedding increases the probability that silver pricing reflects strategic value rather than short-term sentiment alone. There's also a geopolitical dimension that cannot be ignored. Trade policy has become a tool of statecraft. Tariffs, sanctions, export controls, and currency restrictions are increasingly used to exert pressure. In this environment, assets that remain neutral gain strategic importance. Silver's exemption preserves its neutrality. It remains tradable across borders even as other goods face restrictions. It avoids becoming a bargaining chip in trade negotiations. It stays accessible to both allies and competitors. That neutrality is not accidental. It reflects an understanding that some assets must remain outside geopolitical escalation to preserve system stability. This matters for global markets. As trade blocs form and supply chains fragment, neutral assets become bridges. They facilitate trade where trust is limited. They provide common ground in an increasingly divided system. Silver's role as such a bridge is understated but real. From an investor perspective, the implications are subtle but significant. This is not a call to speculate. It is a call to reassess. Silver is often dismissed as a volatile secondary metal, overshadowed by gold in monetary discussions and by copper in industrial analysis. That framing no longer captures its policy position. Silver is now explicitly protected in a world where protectionism is rising. That protection does not guarantee returns. It does not eliminate volatility. It does not replace productive assets. But it changes the downside risk profile. In a tariff-heavy environment, many assets face policy headwinds. Silver does not. In an inflationary environment driven by trade friction, silver historically preserves purchasing power. In a world of currency uncertainty, silver remains globally recognized. These characteristics do not make silver dominant, they make it resilient. Resilience is often undervalued until it becomes scarce. This decision also offers a broader lesson about how modern policy operates. Change rarely announces itself. It embeds itself in technical language, annexes, classifications, and exemptions. The most important shifts often occur where few people are looking. The silver exemption is one such shift. It does not scream, it whispers. It tells you how policymakers think about supply chains, security, and economic stability. It tells you which materials they consider too critical to politicize. It tells you where they draw the line between leverage and self-inflicted damage. That information is invaluable. Markets eventually catch up to policy reality. They may do so slowly, unevenly, and with volatility, but they do so nonetheless. When they do, assets that were structurally advantaged tend to reprice. Not explosively, but persistently. This is how long-term trends emerge, not from headlines, but from incentives, not from rhetoric, but from architecture. Silver's exemption from tariffs is part of that architecture. It reshapes incentives quietly, steadily, and with compounding effect. The global market will adjust, manufacturers will adapt, investors will reassess, and silver's role will evolve accordingly. This does not mean silver becomes the center of the financial system. It means it becomes harder to ignore. In a world defined by fragmentation, resilience matters more than dominance. Silver, by policy design, has been positioned on the resilient side of the ledger. That is the real significance of this decision. Not what it did today, but what it set in motion for tomorrow.